Hello, listeners, and welcome to a new episode of Business Compact, the podcast for founders, seasoned business owners, or everybody else who is interested in learning about the world of international business. In each episode, we will explore topics related to the creation, growth, and globalization of businesses, from founding challenges to international growth opportunities. Our guests will share their insights, personal opinions, and lessons learned along the way, inspiring you to take a closer look at each individual discussed topic. My name is Tobias Kerkhoff, and I'm the General Manager for Internationalization at OneIB International Business and your host for this episode. I hope you enjoy the upcoming conversation. And as always, if you have any comments, need support for your international business, or want to be on this podcast as a guest too, you're welcome to contact me under my email shown at the beginning of this episode. Finally, of course, feel free to subscribe to this podcast and our newsletter. Joining me on today's podcast is Marc Zander, CEO and founder of Africon, a consultancy supporting companies with their market entry and long-term growth in Africa. Over the years, Africon has realized more than 160 client projects in Africa, but I don't want to reveal too much right now about the company. So welcome, Marc. I really appreciate you making time for this episode of Business Compact.
Hi, Tobias. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Then let's start right away. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and Africon.
Tobias, thank you very much for the question, and thanks for having the opportunity to speak a little bit about Africon. I myself am doing Africa for the past 26 years, and I've been working and living in Africa, mostly in Nigeria, for almost 5 years, but I have extensive experience on the continent. In 2011, I had the opportunity to set up Africon, a dedicated specialized consultancy with the sole focus for Africa and the sole focus for the African continent and advisory to companies who want to grow their business in Africa. As you already said, for the past 11 years, we've done about 160, 170 projects for clients mostly seeking to expand their business on the African continent, but also companies who wanted to set up production, companies who wanted to invest, so different services as Africon. We do realize that with a team of about 30 consultants in 8 offices on the African continent, so whenever we do research, whenever we make a strategic advice to companies, we do that out of the offices we have in Africa, where we believe comes the most value to our clients. Because if clients have questions on the African region, how do we grow, who is the best partners, what's the route to market strategy, etc., I think the answers and the research from the markets locally is the key value for our clients.
Thanks for your introduction. So we both are passionate about emerging markets and international expansion. Whereas you are a recognized expert for Africa, I'm more experienced doing business in Latin America. But for sure, both continents have a lot of things in common, not only a young aspiring population, warmth of the inhabitants, and passion for dancing and singing. Based on your many years of experience as a trusted advisor, expert for Africa, what are the biggest challenges and opportunities for companies doing business in Africa?
I think it's one of the typical questions, obviously, in terms of the opportunities and challenges. And let me start with the opportunities. Africa, for the past many years, has developed and grown the population to about 1.4 billion people. And with this large population, which is urbanizing, which is growing a middle class, which is providing a workforce, there are many opportunities for companies. One opportunity is obviously understanding the African population as consumers. And we've advised a lot of companies in the food business, in the food packaging business, and the opportunities are massive when it comes to investment into the food sector, when it comes into the sector of pharma, when it comes of the sector to hospitals and medical applications. So there are lots of opportunities just deriving out of the large population. And again, as stated, there are other opportunities which come from a lot of minerals which are available on the African continent. There are other opportunities by finding new markets with clients and consumers on the continent. Obviously, some of the challenges are the fact that the African markets are still very scattered. We talk about 54 countries. It is quite difficult to come up with a common strategy for the whole continent. So you will have to treat every of the countries separately. And obviously, one of the challenges is to understand the vast differences of the African continent. I think is one of the key points where companies still struggle. The second is the time to do business in Africa. Obviously, it takes a long time to do business in Africa. And one of the challenges is to be patient, wait for the business to start and to grow in Africa. And the challenge is the long timing, which is sometimes take. Another challenge is the limited markets. I mean, I spoke about the opportunities and they're all there, but all in all, some of the markets are still small. When it gets to selling the products, when it gets to understanding on how big the markets really are, that is still a challenge, where to go, how to find that. And this is obviously something we advise the clients on.
Very interesting. Thank you. I guess the challenges and opportunities you've just mentioned can differ not only depending on the country, but also depending on the industry. Since you're working or have worked successfully together with clients from the automotive industry, chemicals, consumer goods, or pharma, just to name some, you have a good overview on the market situation. Which sectors are currently of particular interest to German companies? And of course, this varies from country to country, so maybe you can give us 2 or 3 practical examples.
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of, and I already spoke about the consumer class, which is rising, there are a lot of opportunities in the packaging industry. And to give you 2 or 3 examples in the packaging industry, the consumers buy a lot of small packed food products. So they buy little snacks, they buy little sachets for detergents, and so on. Now, some of the companies in Germany, just to name a few, Bosch, Teegarten, and others, are machine producing companies who already sell successfully to the African markets. The same is for Krones, the same is for GEA, some of the very typical German companies who have successfully entered the markets in Africa and have grown. So with the growing consumer classes, obviously, there is a need to pack snacks and food properly. So that's obviously a very good example where you can see on how the African markets are growing, but also where German, but also international companies are benefiting. Maybe the second is the payment and IT space. So with 1.4 billion people entering into the payment space and wanting to have access to bank accounts, a lot of companies have successfully conquered the markets by, selling machinery for the production of debit cards, for the production of credit cards, but also mobile applications, which are very frequently used on the African continent. Here, some very practical examples are companies who have set up a production for debit cards. So there is a French company, very strong French company, who set up this and who's been successfully selling to the African markets for years, just because African middle classes are entering into the banking space and do require debit and credit cards. So these are 2 of the very good examples where I've seen a lot of success. Maybe thirdly, and I've just been to Rwanda, a complete different sector is finding skilled labor. So there is a German company training skilled labor employees in Rwanda to be working in the sector of hospitality in Germany. And for the moment, they teach Rwandese to speak German, and they also train them on how to work in a hotel or restaurant. And these skilled labor talents come to Germany, working in some of the hotels and hospitality areas here. So this is also a very good example of a successful company being active on the continent.
Thanks for sharing these examples with us. Currently, we are living in challenging times with a fast-changing economic environment, increased energy prices, still supply chain shortages, rising interest rates, so that many companies, especially here in Germany, strive for risk reduction or at least put more emphasis on their risk management. Now, the question is, how do you still convince companies to invest in such a volatile continent like Africa right now?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a very interesting thing to see. What we currently see are very strong topics like diversification, trying to get rid of being dependent on one or two markets. And at the moment, we have a strongly increasing demand for companies who want to be active in Africa. Why? Because they want to reduce the risk of only being active, for example, in Asia. So with the Russia and Ukraine war and the dependency on the supply chains in Asia, we currently do not need to convince companies to be active in Africa, but it's rather a new demand which is upcoming, where companies say we need to nearshore. So we need to go to North Africa, which is very close to us here in Europe, which is one of the very, very great opportunities to reduce risk. But we also want to start new consumer markets or new markets where we can sell to, meaning getting less dependent on the Asian markets, not only for the production, but also as a consumer market. We do not need to convince companies at the moment, but they rather see Africa as a new opportunity to diversify their risk at the moment, resulting in very interesting questions for production, but also for new markets in Africa.
Yeah, totally makes sense to me. According to my own experience, before making a final decision of a market entry, it's always necessary to get an impression of the target market on site. Research, market investigations are very helpful tools to understand the markets or to get a first idea. Still, one thing is theory and another thing is the situation on site. In this context, business and delegation trips are extremely useful. And if I'm right, you recently organized the delegation trip of the Ministry of Rhineland-Palatinate to Rwanda. Can you share some insights with our listeners of this important delegation trip and why exactly Rhineland-Palatinate is interested in maintaining relationships with Rwanda?
Yes, you're very correct. It was a very interesting project for us, especially for me as well, being the Africa advisor to the Minister Daniela Schmidt, who traveled to Rwanda, not only because this was a new trip, but because Rwanda and Rhineland-Palatinate do have a working Africa relation or business relation for over 45 years. So it was very interesting to see that a country like Rhineland-Palatinate has a strong relation to Rwanda for many, many years. And why this is happening is because various companies from Rhineland-Palatinate are active in Rwanda. The example I just shared with the search for skilled labor is only one, but there are many, many others. For example, a company from Rhineland-Palatinate supports local farmers in Rwanda in improving their yields with artificial intelligence. So they have a platform and monitoring devices on the fields where the farmers can obtain data and improve on the use of pesticides, on the use of fertilizer, etc. So there are various companies of Rhineland-Palatinate active in Rwanda, and they are quite successful in exploring the business there. So having had the opportunity to travel with Daniela Schmidt to Rwanda was quite interesting for us. And we saw really a very interesting relationship with Rwanda and Rhineland-Palatinate.
Thank you very much. I was not aware of this fact, of this long-term 45 years relationship between Rhineland-Palatinate and Rwanda. Of course, in the political context, Africa assumes an important role. Keywords, foreign aid, raw materials, and skilled workers. How would you describe the cooperation with political institutions and organizations such as GIZ, the German Agency for International Cooperation, GTAI, Germany Trade and Invest, or the German Chambers of Commerce abroad?
There were two aspects to it. One is, how do these organizations work with Africa and how do we work with them? So I think all of these organizations play a vital role in bringing Africa on the map to German companies. And if it's GIZ, if it's GTAI, if it's the German chambers, they all have a role to play in being ambassadors for the African region. We have been working with most of these organizations in some projects, which is quite interesting to us. To give you a couple of examples, GIZ sometimes has tenders open for market research or some other data they require for the African region, where Africon can play a vital role with our staff on ground, which helps GIZ to understand more about the markets and to get another perspective than the GIZ perspective. With the German Chambers of Commerce, we share different projects, which I think is also very interesting for us to work together. And for GTAI, we sometimes share the same data. I think what is very important, and which is a very interesting project I've seen, is the recent website of the Africa Business by GTAI, which allows people to understand more about the potentials in Africa. And therefore, I would say, even in the political context, it is important to have these organizations. Maybe one thing I might criticize is that all of these organizations have a bit of their own agenda. So everybody does their own project, has their own strategy, their own view on Africa. And I think what is very important is that Germany, with other African countries, comes together and has one common voice towards the African region, and probably also to the companies here in Germany, as the different offerings sometimes does confuse the German companies.
I totally agree. Based on my own experience from the past, working together with political institutions and organizations, the cooperation can be deepened even more. And this clearly depends, on the one hand, on the political organization itself, and on the other hand, on the management team of the organization and their willingness to cooperate. We are almost at the end. Two more questions are left. According to my own point of view and how the recent example of Niger has shown, sometimes politicians seem to me overly optimistic, or in other words, a little naive with their views on Africa. What demands or suggestions would you make to politicians in order to facilitate business relationships with Africa and establish a stable long-term partnership?
I mean, one of the key points, I think, is, and this some other countries are already doing very well, is treating Africa more on an eye-to-eye level. We've been trying to educate, to teach, to demand from the African region and from African countries certain things which I think do not make sense. I think we should treat Africa as an equivalent trading partner, as an equivalent partner for business. And one of the suggestions I really would make is to say, let's sit on the table and discuss what is needed. Let's discuss what Africa has to offer for Germany, or what Germany has to offer for the African region, or even the EU. So I think it is very, very important to come a little away from a viewpoint where the Africa strategy of a ministry in Germany and or the EU dictates that African countries should be doing this and should be doing that, blah, 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 to do business with us in the EU. I think we really need to sit down on a table, have an eye-to-eye discussion, treat ourselves equivalent, and then take it from there. Maybe another advice from my side could also be that we have a little bit more understanding for the cultural nuances that play in the different African countries, where I think it is very important to understand them and probably apply them to the way we work together.
Thanks, very useful suggestions, and hopefully one or two politicians have been listening to your answer. Last question, and I know it's difficult to limit the answer of this question to only 3 words. How would you describe the future of Africa in only 3 words?
That's a very, very difficult one. I'm a strong fan of the African region, so I would probably put it in some very positive words, where I would say striving, opportunistic continent.
Yeah, I'm sure you could also have used 100 more words to describe the future of Africa. For instance, my 3 words would have been growth, emerging, and diversified. So unfortunately, we have come to the end of today's episode of Business Compact. Thanks, Marc, for this interesting conversation about Africa. I think we covered a lot of ground. All the best for you and your next projects, and I hope we can meet soon.
Thanks, Tobias, for the invitation.